Recording, there we go. All right, and just a note about questions specifically, it is somewhat unlikely that I will be able to address every single specific recipe question that people might be struggling with. Just as, kind of a starting point, high altitude baking is certainly not an exact science, and unfortunately does not always have a super easy or cut and dry solution, as you will certainly learn in this presentation. But our goal with this presentation is to help provide you with some tools and some options to try. All right, and like I said, my name is Laura Griffin, and I'm the FCS agent here in Pueblo County. I welcome you from all of you from Pueblo County as well as beyond. All right, so to get started, just some objectives for today. We hope by taking this webinar that you will be able to first off, locate and use online tools to assist in determining the elevation of your home kitchen or the kitchen in which you plan to bake in. Also that you understand the roles that key ingredients play in successful high elevation baking. Additionally, that you can identify which high elevation recipe adjustments may be necessary for better baking results. And realizing that not all adjustments are necessarily created equal for all recipes. So again, this is unfortunately not a very cut and dry science, but that this gives you a really good starting point for addressing some of your baking challenges. And then finally, of course, we hope that you can successfully bake your products using those high elevation adjustments. All right, so starting with a little bit of a history lesson, CSU and CSU Extension have actually been involved in high altitude baking research since 1908. So as you can see, we've been doing research on this topic for over a century now, and unfortunately, we still don't have it all figured out, and we still struggle to produce really high quality baked goods at certain altitudes. So this photo here is actually the first official high altitude baking lab. So this photo was taken in the 1900s, and it is in Estes Park and is located at about 11,800 feet. And that second photo is a photo of Dr. Inga Allison, and she was really kind of the pioneer in this subject of research of high altitude baking. So all of the research started at that Estes Park location, and then about 20 years later, that Dr. Inga Allison partnered with the CSU Mechanical Engineering Department, and they were able to develop about a 7 by 9 foot steel cylinder chamber. And this was located on campus in Fort Collins. So it gave her the ability to do a lot more trials and research without having to travel to the mountains. It also helped to simulate various cooking conditions ranging everywhere from sea level up to 14,000 feet. By controlling different aspects, including the temperature, pressure, and humidity. So this gave her the opportunity to run trials at a 14,000 foot range rather than just that 11,800 foot location. And honestly, many of the adjustments that you see on the side of like cake mixes or box cake or baked goods are still stemming from a lot of this research done by CSU in the 1920s. So it's kind of cool that CSU has been so heavily involved in this topic for such a long time. All right, so high altitude baking, it does involve a little bit of physics, and I'm not gonna lie, physics was never my favorite subject in school, but in order to really understand why a lot of this or a lot of these challenges are occurring, we do need to involve a little bit of physics. So I will do my very best to explain that in a clear and concise manner. All right, so this is a graphic that just shows some of the varying elevations throughout the state of Colorado. On average, our elevation is about 6,800 feet. And our lowest point is going to be about 3,300 feet, which is located outside of Ray, which is in the northeast corner of the state, definitely on the plains. So that's going to be our lowest point in the whole state of Colorado. And as a result of that being our lowest point, every single square inch of Colorado is going to be considered high altitude. So anything above that 3,000 mark is considered by definition high elevation. And so no matter where you are located across the state, it is likely that your baking is going to be affected by your elevation to some degree. Obviously, the higher you go, usually the more challenging it can be. But even at that 3,000 foot, we might need to make adjustments for some of our baking. All right, so like I mentioned, all of Colorado is above that 3,000 foot mark and is going to be considered high elevation. But what's really most important for you guys is to know your exact elevation. So if you're not aware, you can go to a website called whatismyelevation.com and you can actually plug in your actual address and it will tell you your exact elevation for your home kitchen. And this can be really important because you might know the elevation of, your town or your city or your county. But a lot of times, especially in Colorado and especially in the higher country, that elevation can range very drastically just from in town to maybe where your house is located. From anywhere from a couple hundred feet to even close to 1,000 feet if you are in the high country. So it's always good to be able to start and know exactly what your elevation is that you're working with in your kitchen to address those specific adjustments. All right, so here we're going to get into some of those physics that I talked about. And I think this is a really nice graphic that kind of explains the effects of some of our high elevation on baking. And so essentially, we are living with a decreased atmospheric pressure. And the way that works is that basically air is going to be all around us at all times, all around us and all around all of our objects that we're living with. And it presses against everything that it touches all the time. And that is what is called atmospheric pressure. And basically at higher elevations, the atmospheric pressure is going to be less. So there's less air and there's less pressure pushing down on everything. So as a result, things tend to be naturally lighter at higher elevation, just because we have that less air, if that makes sense. And you can see that in that photo. Our lowest point of the state is going to be near that Ray, Colorado, and we just have more air coming down from the atmosphere, creating more pressure. Whereas in comparison to Leadville, we're over 10,000 feet and we have less air and then less pressure. So again, things are going to seem lighter at that higher elevation. All right, so these are a couple examples of what that lower atmospheric pressure does to your baking. So first, things like cakes and breads, they tend to actually rise super easily because there isn't that pressure pushing down on it. But they actually rise almost too easily to the point that a lot of times they overexpand, which eventually causes them to collapse. And this happens particularly commonly in the center of our baked goods. So we can see those breads in that photo. That's a perfect example of overexpansion and then that structural collapse in the center. Another example is that the vapor pressure or heat required to bring water to boil is actually lower at higher elevations. So this can result in some foods taking longer to cook. So you can see in this photo that was taken at our teaching lab in Fort Collins at an elevation of right about 5,000 feet. That water is actively boiling at a temperature of 204 degrees. So that is in comparison. If you were at sea level, it would actually boil at 212 degrees. So kind of a significant difference there. All right, so this is another example of what happens as atmospheric pressure decreases, or again, that air becomes lighter. So this is actually a bag of snacks that was purchased in Denver and driven up to Leadville, where one of our campus specialists has a property up there. So as you can see, as that elevation increased, it just became lighter and more air in our product. All right, so another factor to consider at higher elevation is going to be decreased relative humidity. So as we increase in elevation, things just have a tendency to naturally feel more dry. And in dry environments, the evaporation rate increases, which actually causes a moisture loss and can change the texture in our doughs and baked goods. So as we decrease our relative humidity, we're also decreasing our moisture holding capacity. Evaporation occurs more rapidly as elevation increases. So the higher you are in elevation, the quicker that evaporation occurs and just the less moisture we have in that environment. And again, that can definitely cause a lot of specifically texture issues with our baked goods. All right, so now we're going to talk about some specific ingredients that are common in our baked goods and how we can adjust them potentially to create a better product. But first, we always want to make sure that we are giving you a reminder about proper food safety. So we don't want to forget about food safety when we are baking. So we just want to make you aware that specifically both flour and eggs are both considered raw agricultural products. So we would recommend making sure that any product you are using flour or eggs in is baked thoroughly and completely before consuming, because there is a risk of foodborne illness associated with those undercooked products. All right. So when baking at a high elevation, you may need to make one adjustment or even more than one of these following adjustments. So there are a number of ways to make adjustments to your baked products, and we are going to go through a whole bunch of different options. And like I mentioned, unfortunately, there's not necessarily one simple solution for all types of baked goods. There's a lot of factors involved, including everything from where the recipe originated from to where you are located. That difference in elevation, the higher you are in elevation, typically the more adjustments you're going to need to make. But we're going to give you a lot of great options and you can kind of play around with it from there. So the first and most common adjustments that we're going to recommend are those to the specific ingredients. So either slightly altering the ingredients or altering the amount of those ingredients. If we find that that doesn't work, then we can start playing with the time of either preparation. So for example, if we are doing breads, the time that we're letting things proof or rise, and or the time of actual processing or baking. And then again, if we're still finding that we're having issues with our baked goods, then we can move on to temperature to try adjusting the temperature of our oven specifically if we're still having issues. All right. So ingredients in baked goods can typically be divided into two main categories. So first, we have our strengthening ingredients. So these are going to be ingredients that give our baked goods structure. So they're strengthening the core of our baked goods. And that is going to most commonly be our flour and our eggs, and especially egg whites. Our other category is going to be our weakening ingredients. So these help to typically provide a more tender texture. They tenderize, they give a little bit more moisture in a lot of cases. And those are going to be our leavening agents, our sugar and fat. And typically, some of our weakening agents are going to be our first adjustments that we're going to try. So we're going to try messing with that leavening agents, sometimes our sugars and our fats first. All right, so where to start? Two really good questions to ask yourself before you start making a lot of the other specific high altitude adjustments is first, is your oven temperature accurate? So if you have an oven thermometer, we would highly recommend that you use it. And if you don't have one, we would highly recommend that you get one. So oven thermometers are really not particularly expensive. You can purchase them online, Amazon, anything like that, and they're pretty easily accessible. And they're going to allow you to just test the different parts of your oven to make sure that you are actually baking things at the correct temperature. So you may find that you're going to get better results if you place things more on one side or the other, depending on if one side is hotter or colder. Also placing things more towards the front or the back of the oven. You can also kind of play around with readjusting the racks and the height of those racks and see if you can really maximize the correct temperature in that oven. Another question to ask yourself is, are you measuring your flour accurately? So with your flour, you want to make sure that you're not adding too much flour in a lot of cases because it is a strengthening agent. It's providing structure. So if we're adding too much flour, our cakes can get really dense or our breads or whatever, and it can really make our structure a little bit too strong in a lot of cases. But we're going to show a video here in a minute about flour measurements specifically. But if you find that your oven temperature seems accurate and you know where to place it within that oven and you are measuring accurately your flour, then we would recommend starting adjustments for first our leavening agents, second, our sugar or sweeteners, and then third, our fat. So again, we're starting with those weakening ingredients. All right, so just some additional information on measuring that flour. So what we want to do is we want to fluff our flour in its container where it's stored, and then scoop it with a spoon into a measuring cup. And then all you're going to do is level it off with a knife. So a lot of people have the tendency to want to really pack it hard into that measuring cup and then kind of pat it down. But a lot of times that is going to involve, over measurement of our flour, and that can affect the outcome in which our baked goods come out. So that is how you would measure it with a measuring cup. Additionally, if you have a recipe that includes weights in that measurement, you can also use a scale, and that food scale is going to give you the very best and most accurate measurement. So with that, I will go ahead and share this video with you. All right.
By scooping the flour out of the measuring flour accurately is important for your high altitude baking. It's common to measure 1 cup of flour by scooping the flour out of the bag or your container and then level it off and calling that a cup of flour. More accurately would be to spoon the flour into your measuring cup, level it off with a knife, And there's 1 cup of flour. Let me show you the difference. We'll measure these. The first cup of flour that was scooped weighs 360 grams. The second that we measured more accurately is 304 grams. A big difference there. That extra flour at high altitude in your baking can cause a dense baked product, and it will be very dry. So it's really important to take the time to do it accurately.
All right, so hopefully everybody could see and hear that okay. I do want to just mention when she is measuring the flour, she does not zero out the scale for the measurement, so that those numbers that she is measuring of the flour are not completely accurate, but she is using the same bowl for both of the flour measurements. So the comparison between the two is accurate. So with the scooping method, you are measuring more flour and potentially too much in that case. But I do just want to warn you, if you are measuring for your own recipe, just to make sure that you don't forget to zero out that scale before you put your bowl or measuring cup on it. All right. So we're going to go through some specific ingredients common in baked goods and kind of their function and how they are affected at elevation. So first we have flour, probably our most common baked good ingredient. And again, this is a strengthening ingredient. So for its function, it's going to provide texture, form, structure, and possibly a little bit of flavor to our baked goods. And kind of a fun fact, some people do use a self-rising flour, which actually has the leavening agents already mixed in. And, it seems like a really kind of nice shortcut, but it can actually be really problematic, especially in high altitude baking. So we would recommend using a primary flour source and then adding your own leavening agents so that you do have the ability and flexibility to adjust those if needed. All right. And then this is kind of a nice table showing some of our different flours. So protein content actually affects how the flour performs in baking application. And the protein content can actually vary quite drastically depending on the type of flour that you're using. So one recommendation to try is, try using the proper type of flour for the type of baked good that you are making if you're having trouble getting the proper consistency. So I'm certainly guilty of this, but a lot of people, they just have all-purpose flour on hand and use it for everything. And typically it does work pretty well for all baked goods, but as you can see, the protein content in all-purpose flour is about double that of cake flour and higher than pastry flour as well. So the protein levels can vary pretty widely. And that is definitely an option for one adjustment that you could try. So flour at high elevation, particularly when we're talking about breads, cookies, and cakes, the flours tend to be drier, which again goes back to our relative humidity, and thus able to absorb more liquid in our higher and drier climates. So as a result, we might need to decrease our flour or possibly add additional liquid to moisten up that batter or dough to make sure that it is a proper consistency. Another option would be using a higher protein flour to create a stronger structure if you're seeing a weak structure in your baked goods. And then for storage purposes, we would always recommend storing your flour in a sealed airtight container to prevent as much moisture loss as possible. rather than leaving it in, the paper bag material that it typically comes in. That's just going to keep your flour fresher and more, and keep some of that moisture in for a longer period of time. All right, so our next ingredient is going to be our leavening agents. And they function by expanding the air in baked goods to give the final product volume and texture. So some of the leavening agents that we are working with typically are going to be yeast, baking powder, baking soda, and beaten eggs. So here is an actual example from a high altitude baking Facebook group. And this is the difference with and without high altitude adjustments. So as you can see, the difference is day and night. So the first one, we have that very overexpanded rising effect. And then these muffins or cupcakes, they just absolutely collapse completely. And then with a few high elevation adjustments, you can see they come out looking absolutely perfect. So this is just a little bit of encouragement that I know this presentation is a little overwhelming with options, and it does take a little bit of work to perfect high elevation baking, but it definitely can be done. All right. So leavening agents at high elevation, typically what happens is that the leavening or the expanding of that air occurs too fast. The gas bubbles combine into larger pockets, and it gives you a coarse texture. And again, that collapsing in the middle. So it rises too quickly, it over-rises, this weakens the structure, and then it causes that collapse in the center when being baked. So this photo here on the right is another great example of high altitude adjustment baking. So first, that photo on the bottom is no adjustments made. So you can see that we had that overexpansion and rise, and then the fall of the bread in the middle. And I can tell you, I've made a dozen loaves of bread that look exactly like that. So that's a very common issue here in Colorado. And then that middle photo is looking a lot better. So that was just one adjustment was made. So that was with the decreasing of the leavening agent. So you can see we didn't have that collapse in the center. Overall, the texture looks a little bit better. And then our third top photo is with multiple adjustments. So that was with the leavening agent being decreased and the temperature being increased of the oven. So that looks like a really good quality piece of bread. And I would mention to you that, all three of these pieces of bread are totally safe to consume from a food safety standpoint, as long as those ingredients, especially those raw ingredients, are cooked thoroughly. All three of these are totally safe and probably fairly delicious to consume. So it's really kind of up to you, the level of which you want to play with these adjustments. Some people are fine with the collapse center. The texture might not be perfect. It doesn't look perfect, but it's still going to taste good. Some people, they might want to make one quick adjustment, and that middle piece is going to be perfectly acceptable to them. Other people might want to keep tweaking and playing around with these adjustments in the recipe to try to get to that third and final photo. So it is something that's kind of flexible from a food safety standpoint. We can play around with it to more or less degrees. Whereas in comparison, at high altitude, if we're doing any sort of food preservation or canning, then those adjustments become crucial that we follow them more directly because that does become a food safety issue. So, but we have more flexibility in the baking world. All right, so our next ingredient is going to be our sweeteners. So the main function with most of our sweeteners is going to be contributing to flavor. It can also contribute to color, texture, and moisture. And if we are working with yeast, our sugars are going to provide food for those yeast cells to grow as well. So most commonly, our sweeteners are going to probably be sugar and brown sugar, but some recipes do call for honey, corn syrup, molasses, or maple syrup, and those would all fall under that sweetener category as well. So the effects of sweeteners at high elevation, basically as liquids evaporate, which we know they evaporate at a higher rate as we go up in elevation, those sugars are going to become more concentrated. So if we have a concentrated amount of sugar or excess sugar, that can cause our cakes to fall in the middle, again, like we see in this photo, and or become more crumbly and dry. So it's going to affect our texture. And then in some cases, in recipes that have a lot of sugar in them, and if you're at a really high elevation, you can actually develop a sugar crust, like we see here in this photo. So this photo almost looks kind of like a glazed donut or a glazed cake, but it's actually just a lack of adjustments within that recipe. All right, so our next ingredient is going to be fat. So the function with fat, it also contributes to flavor, moisture, and overall mouthfeel. So kind of the texture there as well. It also is very much a weakening agent or ingredient. So it's going to help tenderize and produce that more tender crumb. Most likely, we're going to be using either shortening, cream, oils, lard, fat, or margarine as our fat sources in baked goods. And then a few other adjustments. Like I said, if none of those other ones work, here are a few more that you can try. Playing with the liquids, playing with the time, again, of either processing or baking, and then finally the temperature. So for liquids, our function is going to contribute to that moisture to hydrate our protein and starches. It also enables chemical reactions to occur with the leavening agents. So again, all of these ingredients work together to kind of form that structure and overall texture. But for liquids, typically we're going to see things such as water, milk, eggs, cream, buttermilk, and in some more rare instances, we could use something like beer or a broth or a juice. All right, so the effects of liquid at high elevation, as that elevation does increase, we're going to get a faster evaporation of moisture, which again increases that concentration of sugars, which can result in a stickiness and that glaze to our baked goods. And our texture can become dry and crumbly. Oops. And then just a quick note about time and temperature. So for time, you might need to increase or decrease based on what you are baking. So for example, with yeast breads, you may be needing to increase your time a little bit. With cupcakes, especially if you're taking a cake mix and turning it into cupcakes, you might need to decrease that baking time. And then for temperature, again, making sure that our oven temperature is accurate by using that oven thermometer, and we know exactly where to place those baked goods within our oven. You may need to increase the temperature, especially again, when making recipes adjusted for smaller sizes. So for example, if we're making a cake recipe and turning them into cupcakes. And then finally, just a few other factors, seasoning and spices. So salt can be a very important part of a baked goods recipe. Salt, it of course adds flavor, but it also contributes to the browning and is needed to slow yeast fermentation as elevation increases. So I know I'm guilty of this, but I would say salt is probably particularly one of the least measured ingredients in baking. So, a recipe might call for half a teaspoon or a teaspoon of salt, and people have a tendency just to kind of give a few shakes of their salt shaker into that dough and mix it in. But I would encourage you to really measure out that salt content because it does play a factor in the overall texture, especially in yeast baked goods. So we want to make sure that we're using that proper amount of salt in our baked goods. And then if we are doing something with seasonings, herbs, or spices, we may need to increase those as we go up in elevation because there's a less perception or pungent flavor as we go up in elevation. So again, this is something that you can kind of play around with from a food safety aspect. You can add a little bit more seasoning or a little bit less to your liking. But if you are finding that the flavoring is not coming quite as strongly as you'd like, you can try increasing those. All right. So finally, we're going to get into some specific recommended adjustments for some specific baked good products. All right, so first we have cookies. So some of our most commonly seen problems with cookies is that they can spread out, they can bake really flat, they can sometimes be underdone and kind of gooey and chewy in the middle. But also on the flip side of that, they can also become too dry or over browned. And so again, cookies are really kind of preference based as far as what high quality cookie texture means to you. So we have two photos here. Both of these cookies are totally cooked thoroughly and are safe from a food safety standpoint. And some people might think that the lower photo is their ideal texture, and some people might think that upper photo is their ideal texture. So cookies, they can be a little bit more chewy and gooey. They can also be a little bit more crunchy and crispy. So you have to keep that in mind when you're making adjustments as well. You want to make sure that you're adjusting it to your liking specifically. So just a few suggestions to get you started with cookies. We would first recommend slightly decreasing the leavening agents and or slightly decreasing that fat and sugar. So again, those weakening ingredients is always a good place to start with our baked goods. Another option would be to chill the dough before baking. So if you find that your dough is a little bit runnier and is kind of hard to work with and is not forming as you'd like, you can try putting it in the refrigerator for 20 or 30 minutes before putting it on the cookie sheets to bake. If your dough seems like it's too stiff, you can add about 1 to 2 tablespoons of liquid. And then again, if none of that works, you can play with your time and temperature. So you might need to increase your oven temperature a little bit. You may need to decrease your cooking time a little bit. All of these should be made in small adjustments to start, and then you can work your way up from there. So we don't want to overbake our cookies. So maybe try, even 30 seconds less or a minute less of regular baking time. All right, next we have cakes. So some of the most common problems we see with cakes, again, that excessive rise off the bat and then that falling or collapsing in the middle. Sometimes the texture can get too coarse and it can also stick to the pan. So very similar to the cookies, first we would recommend decreasing those leavening agents slightly, decreasing the sugar and fat to hopefully help strengthen the cell structure. You can try increasing the amount of eggs for richer cakes. This will contribute to liquid and strength. You can also try increasing the other liquids in the recipe. And then again, you can try increasing your oven temperature by maybe 15 to 25 degrees to help set that cake before the gases overexpand. And with any adjustments that you're making, you have to start from somewhere. And then you can only really grow as you repeat these experiments and make more or different adjustments each time. So I know it can be kind of a lengthy process, but I highly recommend, if you are serious about making changes to these recipes, keeping some sort of a log with the original recipe, what you've tried, and what the results are. And everyone has access to a smartphone now, and so taking photos can be a really great way to track results as well. And you can kind of compare what it looked like this time to what it looked like last time, and really keeping an eye on what you did differently. All right, so some specifics for whipped egg leaven cakes. So these are going to be some of our lighter and fluffier cakes, such as chiffon, angel food, and sponge cakes, which, to be honest, can be some of the most challenging to get the texture correct, especially at high elevation. But we would recommend under whipping your egg whites. So stiffer peaks are going to result in a tougher final product. So by under whipping those egg whites a little bit, it's hopefully going to create a little bit more of a softer cake, which is what we're looking for with these cakes specifically. Another option would be adding a small amount of an acid source. So for example, you can add a little bit of cream of tartar to your egg whites, or use a natural cocoa for chocolate flavored cakes. You can also try increasing the flour as a final option. All right, so this is just kind of a nice representation of different stages of whipping egg whites. So the leavening agent, it's basically largely air, and it expands to create even more air. So it needs structure from the egg whites so that that cake doesn't fall or sink. So we would recommend beating your egg whites until they are soft and shiny and they have soft peaks, but not stiff or dry peaks. So we can see in this photo, the first stage, it's kind of foamy. We're not really getting any peaks. That second photo of the soft peaks, that is what we are ideally looking for at elevation. So it does have structure to it. It does have a peak to it, but it's not totally stiff. It's kind of bending downwards, still has a little bit of flexibility with it. And then we have our stiff peaks, which again, is going to probably result in a tougher final product. You're not going to get that really squishy, soft texture that you're looking for specifically in chiffon or angel food cakes. And then finally, we have our over whipped, which basically just loses all structure altogether. Some other adjustment options that we have for angel food cakes would be to decrease that sugar. So similarly to our other cakes and cookies, increase the flour, and then finally, again, increasing that oven temperature. All right, so next for biscuits, muffins, and quick bread recipes, probably our most common problem is, again, that collapse due to the rapid gas expansion from the leavening agents. So our solutions, very similar, starting with decreasing that leavening agent, possibly increasing our liquid. You can try using a higher protein flour. So on that chart, our bread flour had the highest protein content. And then finally, again, trying to increase our oven temperature. For our yeast breads, so similarly to when we're baking, yeast breads can actually overproof and overexpand during their rising phase. And this is going to result in a really heavy collapsed loaf. So we want to be particularly cautious and only let our dough rise until it has doubled in size. So if we're using a recipe that was developed at sea level, it might say that we need to rise this dough for an hour, but we really want to make sure that we're keeping an eye on our dough because we might only need to rise it for 30 minutes or 40 minutes, just whatever it takes till it only doubles in size. You want to make sure also that you have a bowl big enough to accommodate for this increase. And some suggestions to avoid overproofing. So we want to just proof our dough twice to help develop that gluten and those flavors, and then leave it alone. You can also try proofing in the refrigerator. This can help slow down that process. And once it's doubled in size, you can punch it down once and proof again. All right, pie crusts. So typically the issues we see with pie crusts are that they can become tough, dry, and crumbly. So by increasing that liquid just slightly, that can help our dough feel a little bit more hydrated and hopefully avoid that dry and crumbly texture. If you're having the opposite problem, to prevent, a soggy crust, we want to bake our pies in the lower third of the oven, closer to that heating element. And then finally, if you're working with puddings, pies, and cream fillings, a double boiler actually does not obtain the temperature needed to gelatinize these starches at elevation. So we would recommend using a heavy pan and direct heat instead. And then this is just an example of a recipe that was adjusted through our teaching lab and in Fort Collins. So we can see the original recipe and then the adjustments that were made in yellow highlighted. So they started with those leavening agents. So the baking soda went from 1 teaspoon down to a ½ teaspoon. So you don't have to make extreme changes. Just a little bit of adjustment can go a long way. And then same thing with the baking powder. So they went down from 2 teaspoons to 3/4 of a teaspoon. So they essentially cut both of those leavening agents in half. They took a little bit more off of that baking powder. And then they added a little bit of liquid. So they added about 1 or 2 tablespoons more of milk. So as you can see, it doesn't necessarily take a lot of changes to make a big effect. And you don't want to go making a lot of big changes really quickly. You won't know exactly what worked, and you may overcompensate and create other issues if you do drastically change the ingredients and measurements too much. All right, so I will just leave you with a reminder and word of encouragement that success is going to be through trial and error. So this is kind of our pattern of success. So we want to start with one suggested adjustment based on your elevation. And again, like I said, there are so many factors, so it's easy to get frustrated. But to get started, start small, start with, one adjustment. If you know for a fact that the recipe was developed at sea level and you are at 10,000 feet, you might feel comfortable making a couple adjustments right off the bat just because that difference is so large. But start small with your adjustments, make the recipe, and then evaluate how it came out and maybe decide what would make that recipe better for next time. And then again, you want to try to keep a log if you can of any adjustments that you made, whether that be in ingredients, time, or temperature, and some notes on what could be improved in the future. And then you'll just keep evaluating, keep adjusting, and hopefully keep improving until you really get to that point that you're hoping to get to with those baked goods. Here are just a few recommended resources for you. So first we have CSU Extension. So like I mentioned, we have literally been doing research on this for a century. And we continue to put forth new research on an annual basis. One of our specialists, she does live in Leadville, so she has access to a lot of high altitude baking time. So you can find all of the latest resources at our website there. We also have our Food Smart Colorado website and our Live Smart Colorado blog. So both of those are going to be great resources for various high altitude baking and cooking and food preservation topics. We also have our Ask Extension program. So if you go to that website, you can submit questions that will be answered by extension agents in your area. We also have the Home Baking Association, which does have some resources on high altitude baking as well. And then there's a few really great books out there. So first is our High Altitude Baking. They're now on their second edition. Pie in the Sky is another great one. It reads kind of like a novel, which is kind of funny, but it's a nice read and it has a lot of good information. The author has actually done research at I think 5 different locations throughout the country and has written this book full of great information of her findings. And then finally, we have Baking Above It All. So all of those, again, are going to be available online on Amazon at your local bookstore. And I would highly recommend checking any of those out if you want additional information. All right, and with that, I thank you for joining us today. And I will take a look at our questions. If you have any more questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we can take a look at that. All right, so our first question is, I always add additional gluten when I bake bread in my bread machine. What is the role of gluten in high altitude baking? That is a great question. And to be honest, I don't have a lot of information on that. Bread machines can be a whole other ballgame just with how they work. But gluten is it's a structuring agent as well. So I would say most likely it would add more structure. So a lot of times in high altitude, we don't need that additional structure. But if it seems to be working well for you, I would encourage you to keep making that adjustment. And then also I use a gas oven. Are there any differences in using gas rather than an electric oven? I don't think there's any major differences. Again, the biggest thing is just making sure that that temperature is actually accurate. So if you're setting your oven to 350, is it really baking things at 350, or is it maybe 5 or 10 degrees off? And again, is it more consistent in the front of the oven or the back of the oven or one side or closer to the heating element, things like that. Thank you for joining us, Brenda. All right. Well, if there are no other questions, you guys will be receiving a follow-up email later this week with the recording and the presentation slides. So if you have any questions in the future, please feel free to give me a call or shoot me an email, and I am more than happy to help. All right. Thanks, everybody, and happy high altitude baking.